in Latin America and the Caribbean. I am Maria Camila Uribe, coordinator of the IDB Cities Network, and I'm pleased to open this opportunity for knowledge exchange on challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for urban leaders who are driving policies to ensure food security and promote local and regional food supply through the connection between city systems or urban systems and food systems in cities. Before we begin, is to contribute to the strength capacity building for municipal officials and promoting synergies with partner institutions as well. For more information and to register your cities, if they're not in the network already, here is a link in the chat where you can sign up to join the network. Before we begin, I would like to share with you our annual plan for what we have this year thus far, just so you have the relevant information. This is our second webinar, where we will be talking about connecting food systems and urban systems. This is the second webinar in a 3-webinar series. The first one was carried out on June 28th, and the third one will be on October 18th. We will talk about immigration and food security in host cities. We also have other series that will be carried out this year. One of them is transit-oriented development, which will be launched in August, and then one on climate action in Latin American and Caribbean cities starting on September 20th. Please be reminded to sign up to our newsletters so that you can receive all of the invitations and registration links. And also, by clicking on that Zoom link that I mentioned, you will be able to join our network, sign up. So now let's start with today's session on food security. We will be talking about urban systems and food systems and their role. Increasingly, cities are expected to find solutions to food problems that arise within their borders. However, many of these problems go beyond borders and require cross-jurisdictional governance mechanisms. Many of these issues include zoning, land use planning, regulations governing urban and peri-urban agriculture, investments in green infrastructure for flood risk reductions and risk to biodiversity, as well as large-scale projects involving modern wholesale food markets or agri-food areas, or fairgrounds. As food systems evolve, the term city region is increasingly recurrent, given the need for food issues to be addressed from a regional perspective that encompasses urban, peri-urban, and rural areas. It is evident that metropolitan governments will have greater access to human and financial resources and, of course, more responsibility and authority to govern the delivery of services in a geographic area and an economic zone. A metropolitan government, for example, can be much more effective for designing and approving, enacting policies and coordinating and governing interventions in multiple subordinate jurisdictions with lower transaction costs and less conflict generated. Through the cases of Quito, Belo Horizonte, and Rosario, we will hear today about how to connect these food systems to the urban systems in the metropolitan area and how this cooperation has led to ensuring more effective governance around food security. To address these issues that we have on today's agenda, we will first hear a presentation of all of these cases that I just listed, and then there will be a roundtable discussion with experts, and so as we so that we can also answer your questions posted in the chat. The session will be moderated by Ophélie Chevalier, lead specialist in the Housing and Urban Development Division at the IDB. And for the presentations, we will hear about the cases of Quito, Belo Horizonte, and Rosario from David Jacome-Poli, team leader of the Pathways to Resilient Development team, ICLEI, at ICLEI, who will be talking about Ecuador, Quito, Ecuador. Juliana Matos Magnani, Director of Promotion of Agroecology and Procurement in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. She will be talking about that city. And Agustina Cid, Secretary of Planning of Rosario in Argentina, who will be talking about Rosario. During the roundtable discussion, we will address key issues related to urban systems and food systems with the participation of Ana Maria Guaita Alfaro, expert in urban food markets. She's a consultant with the FAO, and Carlos Salazar, lead specialist in the Urban Development and Housing Division, Housing and Urban Development Division at the IDB. We look forward to a very fruitful discussion. But before we begin, we have a couple of questions for the audience. For this session, we will, as usual, resort to Mentimeter, through which we will be able to see questions and answers in real time. Let's proceed to our first question so that we have a better idea for the benefit of the panelists and the rest of the audience as to what the makeup of today's audience is which sector do you belong to? So please either scan the QR code or go to Mentimeter and use that code so that you can answer this initial question. Here are our answers. Please keep voting. Feel free to scan that QR code so that so as to speed up the process. We would like to hear from all of you through Mentimeter. Now, question number 2. What are the main urban systems that make it possible to ensure food security in cities, in your experience? So what are, in your opinion, those main urban systems? So please go ahead and answer. What can help us improve food security? Markets. Good. So markets, transit, urban agriculture, those are the ones that stand out. Then people are still writing. There are some very interesting answers popping up. Some of them are smaller, are there in smaller print, but they will help us with this discussion today. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Ophélie, who will be our moderator today. Thank you for joining us today, Ophélie, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Maria Camila. It's always a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. Now, to continue with what Maria Camila just said, you work with cities, with urban areas. Why are we talking about food security then? So when faced with that question, my answer is usually, let us not overlook the fact that our region is one of the most urbanized in the world, with marked by great inequality, and a great deal of what is produced in the countryside is consumed in the cities. So planning, governance, and urban planning is very, very important when it comes to food security. So with that in mind, I would like to first give the floor to David Jacobo Poli. He will talk about the situation in Quito, the case of Quito with the agri-food project. This is part of the agri-food policy, and this was part of the Quito 2040 vision and planning. So what we're looking for is to see how food issues will help us with our planning process that is carried out by urban planners, but that we did not have on the radar, in the radar. And David, with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you. I'd like to thank the IDB for inviting me to this roundtable discussion and to share with you the experience of Quito. Quito story starts back in the early 2000s with the Agrupar urban agriculture project. The idea is to bridge the gap, the food gap, especially for those most vulnerable amongst urban dwellers. So this program is based on this program. Why was it implemented? We found a need to tie this program to governance and urban planning processes. So this work hinges on private areas where people can produce their own food, but it was also a need for other areas to be devoted to food production. Along the way, we understood that food insecurity also contributes to vulnerability and to the lack of resilience in cities. And that was also factored into the Quito's resilience strategy. And this is part of the 2040 vision for Quito, which is a long-term aspiration that we have. And this was developed in a participatory manner with other stakeholders. And by using these tools, we came to the agri-food agreement, the Quito agreement, which is fostered by the public sector and through the city's economic development agenda, and where Agrupar is hosted together with other partners hailing from the private sector. For example, Ricolto is an NGO that works in the area. Also, the Raj Foundation is another case in point. And organizations behind, these are the organizations behind the agri-food agreement in Quito, involving the national government agencies and others, local agencies in Quito and local government, as well as the private sector through several links in the agri system in Quito. So that goes from consumers to producers, distributors, marketers, and retailers, and those that work with waste management as well. So all of this became very important in order to discuss the future of the agri-food system in Quito. And we agreed on the agri-food charter of the city, containing over 30 points on which all of the stakeholders agreed, and that will, of course, inform public policy. For example, the land planning and zoning master plan was also based on that information, took it into account. But this is not something that happens in a vacuum. Quito does have other participatory mechanisms in place, such as Ordinance 102, regulating citizens' participation. And through this ordinance, we were able to start implementing the resilience strategy in the city. The ultimate goal was to build together with community leaders or neighborhood leaders the agenda for resilience for each of those neighborhoods. So above and beyond that participatory process, links were created with those neighborhood leaders that have led to building response capacity within the city during the pandemic. The municipality of Quito, the city of Quito, knows where its most vulnerable population is, and thanks to its population census. So we know, for example, where most single mothers are, or where female-led households are, and other issues leading to vulnerability or multidimensional poverty. But that only goes down to a certain level, to the level of 3 or 4 blocks. We don't know what doors to knock on when time comes, for example, or when time came to hand out food during the pandemic. So in the municipality of Quito and the city of Quito, we needed to find partners to help us identify which households specifically were most vulnerable. And that is what calls for public participation and citizens' participation, not just as part of going through the motions, but rather as a critical part of our work for the cities. And working with these neighborhood leaders, I may say, is a process that needs to be carried out with a great deal of patience and with broader and longer term benefits in mind. It may be difficult at times, but it is well worth it. And bearing in mind the need to implement a metropolitan scale plan, which is such as the Quito Agreement, which is one of the lessons learned that I would like to share with all of our colleagues here with us today. And in closing, let me say that Quito is struck by the same problems as many other cities in the region. Whenever there is a new administration that comes in, their plans are also left unfinished, and they tend to start over from scratch. But being able to connect with more stable sectors in the public sectors through the agri-food agreement or this other participatory agreement, by doing that, more stability is lent to these processes. The agri-food Quito Pact agreement was able to transcend administrations. I mean, it may have been hit somewhat, but it's still there and very much alive, because all sectors are interested in keeping this pact, this agreement in place, and having an influence on public policy through it. The same can be said about the close ties between the municipality of Quito and neighborhood leaders, to a greater extent with some than others. But the underlying message is that these processes, these plans, these projects and programs, as long as they are anchored within sectors that are more stable, will stand a better chance of surviving the changes in administration. Hopefully, I haven't exceeded the time allotted to me, and that what I said is useful to all. Thank you, David. Thank you. There are two things that I'd like to point out about what you just said. First of all, there's the major example of Ecuador and participatory mechanisms, and how that can be applied to public policy, and how it can grow with the territory, and it now can be applied at the metropolitan level. And secondly, that food is directly tied to resilience, and oftentimes we don't have that in mind. And that is a great segue for the next speaker, Juliana Matos from Belo Horizonte. Welcome. She will be talking to us about the Abastecer program, which is another facet of resilience, and how to access the most disenfranchised and vulnerable areas of the population and provide them with food.
Thank you for the opportunity of sharing this program. And I'd like to begin by talking about the situation in Belo Horizonte. It's located in the state of Minas Gerais, in the southeastern region of Brazil. It's a city having a metropolitan area consisting of 34 municipalities, and the city totals 2,315,000 inhabitants in a very small territory. We have approximately 330,000 square kilometers, and we almost do not have any free area. We have no rural areas in Belo Horizonte. It's very densely populated. And within our city hall, in our city hall, food supply has to do with social security, food security and citizenship, and we have sub-offices, for instance, and we have a Secretariat of Support to Agroecology and Food Supply. We have 3 axes, one of food production by means of the Department of Agroecology Support, Family Agriculture, and Urban Agriculture. We also have an office to support food supply and its trading, and we have a food bank, and we work throughout the whole cycle, always from the standpoint of food security. So our actions are always meant to coordinate deserts and food surpluses, and we also want to promote healthy and sustainable food production. So we support agroecological food thanks to a policy of supporting food supply by means of urban agriculture. We also support sustainable food supply, and in the metropolitan area, which I'm going to approach later on. Now, as to the sales of food supply, we try to associate this sustainable food production to certain spaces, certain farmers markets, for instance. We try to support this production in spaces we have in the city. We have open air markets, we have farmers markets, all that to support sustainable food supply or food production. We have municipal markets with a wide variety of products. We have the so-called Abastecer program that regulates prices, ensuring fair prices for low-income brackets. And we have a program to support family food production and urban food production by means of a public space coordinated by a network of cooperatives of family food producers, aiming at making logistics easier, both in wholesale and retail markets for this kind of production. We also work with food surplus, either by donating foods or by composting urban food waste, thereby closing the loop. Now, the metropolitan connection. We encourage the agroecologic production, considering that Belo Horizonte has a small territory. So in addition to urban food production, we support agroecological or sustainable agricultural practices by coordinating the municipalities. We give them technical support. We provide them with spaces to sell their products, and we have an organic stamp in our public trading spaces. We have a bill that intends to institute sustainable food production pole in the metropolitan area of Belo Horizonte. Now, talking about the Abastecer program, we have a certain number of public spaces. We provide spaces with a low rent than market values. And since we provide this space at a lower price, the food proponent has to propose certain food spaces at a maximum price we establish. So we regulate the price of staples in given areas, and we also regulate the supply market as far as quality, price, and availability are concerned. So we ensure the sales of healthy food products in given spaces. Another objective is to reduce middlemen. These food producers supply 16 vegetables and at a maximum price of 1.99 reals. And last year we traded or we sold 12 tons of food products. We have public notice and a request for proposal, and there we establish a number of criteria in order to regulate products from sustainable agricultural practice and urban food production. So the proponents present an offer, and then we qualify them according to their profile, experience, quality of product, and affirmative actions. So companies having women and Afro-Brazilian descendants, all this is valued, thinking of the food safety for these small entrepreneurs. And we also have a score for their technical proposals. So entrepreneurs or food producers willing to supply products from family production or from sustainable agricultural practices, who are willing to donate food products, who are willing to use solar energy, etc. We take all these criteria into account to establish who will be able to use our public spaces. And we have also monthly price, which is below a market value, and the value per square meter varies according to the area. So areas that are more valued will have a higher price, and spaces in more suburban or peripheral areas will have a lower price per square meter. And finally, I'm going to mention the product mix. What the food producers should offer. We conducted a nutritional study, so we supply products from 3 food groups: vegetables, fruits, and a protein, which is a large white egg.
List of products, and at least 12 green and yellow. It's not bad. And they can supply according to the seasonal items, 12 at least of the green and yellow veggies. That's what I had to share with you today.
Thank you, Juliana. That's a very interesting example because it looks like you're basically focused on the oversight of quality as well as price. And you also provide and for the needs of the most vulnerable communities. So, David, Juliana, would you like to just respond to questions and comments relating to both the Quito and Belo Horizonte case studies? So, I know that we were looking at some of the key terms for the webinar today, and one term that kept coming up has to do with urban agriculture. That was reiterated, I think, by Juliana. And I would now like to offer the floor to Cristina Gonzalez from the Office of Urban Planning in Rosario, Argentina. They've looked at agroecology, both urban as well as the metropolitan area related agroecology. And this is, again, tailored to the needs of low income communities. And so in Rosario, we know that there it's a part, as was already identified. We've seen that tied to the municipal urban planning effort. So go ahead. I'll give you the floor, Juliana. Actually, Juliana, could you take your presentation down so that we can provide space for the next presentation? Agustina? Yes. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am able to put on my screen. And so in Rosario, this dates back to 2001. And the proposal or the focus is just to discuss the urban ecology in Rosario that looks at these objectives to include to ensure food sovereignty for the city. This again started in 2001 during the country's economic crisis. And this was a way of providing food to the city, also to support sustainable production, food production in this urban agricultural space. And then the focus again was to provide healthy food products so that the consumer can have easy access to these products. Also reduce the carbon footprint in food production that takes place near these areas of urban consumption. And this was part of the municipal objectives. And we believe that we're confident that we're achieving this. And then also we looked at another objective was to manage efficiently the urban and environmental resources. We know that there were many vacant lots that nobody was using. So we looked at how we could provide alternative uses for these vacant lots that could also meet many of the environmental environmental priorities. That's contributing to protecting a more absorbing soil to deal with the effects of climate change. So we're using these resources increasingly, and at the same time, we're addressing many urban challenges. Rosario is actually a metropolitan area with 26 suburbs and communities, and we want to make sure that we contain urban sprawl in this metropolitan area by meeting many of these urban planning objectives. So we also look at one of our strengths is recognizing these low-income families as key stakeholders in the production processes. Also, many of these, as I said, vacant lots have now become, in fact, waste disposal areas as well. And we've looked at how food now can be grown in many of these areas, and then they can be sent right to the markets, the food markets. So we have a direct relationship between the food producers and the consumers. They can market their products in many of these food markets, open air markets. And we also look at another strength is providing that possibility to access to urban areas. So what we're showing here, the numbers these are the urban gardens, and we are signing agreements with many of these urban authorities. We have municipal gardens, food growing gardens, and the municipal government will lease out these lands, and also looking at other areas for waste disposal. So these are, again, these are the agreements that have been signed. All the numbers that we see are areas of food production. And these little icons are areas for sales points, a special market, for example, that is operating 7 days a week. Others are open air markets, and they'll operate on specific days of the week where people can go and buy these locally grown goods. And now we're going to share this video to give you a better idea. Let's see if we can can we see the picture? We see it, but we don't hear it.
También tiene importancia, se llama la isla de calores, área que puede moderar
Bueno, espero que hayan podido ver bien el
Well,
video y
I
escuchar.
hope you could at least see the video
Lo voy a dejar acá porque no sé
if you
cómo
didn't
ver,
hear it.
creo que ya estoy cumpliendo el horario, pero cualquier cosa
I know that
o
my
no sé,
time has run out,
querés preguntarme
but I'm
algo,
more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you, Agustina. I'm glad you posted the video on the chat because we couldn't hear it very well.
Dale.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. We have two discussants with us, and then we're also going to be taking questions from the Q&A box. But there's a couple of questions that have been, in fact, we can respond in writing. And so thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. Ana Maria, welcome. Thank you for being here with us. So I think of the three presentations, there are two topics that I think we could highlight, looking at, for example, planning, public policies, and how to include the food issues and how we can formulate this priority into processes. Also looking at urban agriculture, as it was said at the beginning of the webinar, there's a great deal of interest in these areas. Agustina and Juliana both mentioned it. I know you work with FAO, and it would be interesting to hear your take on this mode of production. So if you could just discuss a little bit about these two areas, that would be fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to focus more attention on the first topic, and then we can delve into the second topic as the discussion unfolds. Thank you very much for inviting me, and we've just finished working with various markets of different scales and looking at some specific vehicles and mechanisms. So what are some of my first impressions? Looking at it from the perspective, the market perspective. But what really stood in our first probe with the public. So the way we can address the processes to be able to provide for more food security needs, when we talk about, when we reflect of some of the key talking points of the webinar, and now that I've seen the presentations, the cases of the various urban centers that were profiled, three things come to mind, three overarching topics. The first is, what is the approach that we are adopting? What are the processes? How do we formulate these interventions? How do we implement the planning process so that we can ensure successful food security goals? And looking at how these are implemented in various regions and urban sectors, looking at market studies and approaches are very important. We need to also understand the flow in the various corridors, so that not only do we understand the dynamics within the urban centers, but also looking at not just the region, but this could even be more complex. And I think this needs to be addressed, since frequently this has been overlooked. And an interesting exercise that looks at I think is the Rosario experience. And within the city, they also have encompassed the surrounding communities as well. So I think it's that, looking at those approaches as we implement processes in involving and improving food security objectives. Also, how are the government measures and resources implemented? And who is responsible for carrying out these initiatives and policies? In the case of Belo Horizonte, it was clearly shown that efforts began from the municipal level, and although they addressed many of these priorities, they defined the boundaries between the budget processes. And so, in fact, there are also some questions that remain outstanding. How are the responsibilities being distributed amongst the various stakeholders? Is it up to the local authorities? And sometimes it takes the government to ensure successful routing of food security priorities, and that it needs to become there needs to be continuity from one administration to another, and also involving various layers of government. The municipal government may take on the leadership role, but they have limited resources, so it needs to include a more comprehensive all of government approach at the various levels, not just municipal. So looking at the urban food security initiatives, we also need to look at the tools available, the areas, the spaces, and of course, these the volume, the values, the numbers are, I think, very clearly mapped out in the Quito case study, but there's still more to be done. But also the focus on the land management and distribution aspects, so that better strategies can be formulated and developed in terms of land management. So I think that perspective is crucial. Now, looking at urban gardens, just getting back to what we said earlier, of course, we can delve into that more during the discussion. So, Carlos, I give you the floor. I think you're on mute, Carlos. Thank you, Ana. Carlos is well, we're actually colleagues. He has written many blogs within the division's blog in terms of the space, and the separation between urban and rural areas sometimes needs to be revisited. So what's your perspective on that, Carlos? Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And in particular, I would like to congratulate the panelists and our other speakers. They're fascinating. I wish we could get into even more detail, because there are many, many ideas, many things that have generated more questions. But what you state when you talk about that dichotomy, urban and rural dichotomy, I think applies to many situations in Latin America. But just to add to the